Thing. We have Anthony here, Papavasiliou, who is an associate professor in Louvain-la-Neuve. He got his PhD from Berkeley, and now he's based in Belgium, and he's interested in power systems, operation research, electricity markets.
Thank you. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you to Louis and Anna for the kind invitation. I'm really excited to talk about this work in front of such a great audience. So this is work that I did with Ignacio Aravena, who's a former PhD student of mine, and he's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab and soon to be a daddy. And also Yves Smears, who's an emeritus faculty at the Université Catholique de Louvain. So the topic is transmission capacity allocation in zonal electricity markets. I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing why we're interested in the topic, because there are some recent developments in the European market that make the issue relevant. I will then proceed to a proposal that we have for modeling zonal markets and convey some of the key policy insights that we have from the work from a very simplified model that already delivers a lot of the important messages. But then, because we also are interested in conducting a detailed policy case study for the Central Western European system, where this policy discussion is becoming relevant these days, we need to also develop some a computational arsenal for dealing with the real problem. And finally, I'm going to discuss conclusions in the end. So, why are we looking at the topic? As some of you may know, Europe, after a long policy evolution, has decided to commit to zonal electricity markets. This was ratified in the 2009 regulation of the European Commission. And the idea in a zonal market is that you basically want to control the net injection of power in a collection of areas, as opposed to sending a separate price signal in different nodes of that area. So you aggregate a collection of areas and you impose a single price in that collection of areas. So basically your control variable now is a it's a low resolution control variable than being able to dispatch individual areas separately through a separate price signal. So in doing that, you can consider two possible approaches of controlling net injections. Because of this aggregation, you have to simplify the representation of the transmission network. So the first approach that you can take, which was what was also implemented in the US markets before the California electricity market crisis, is the assumption that you have a transportation network, basically, and what you impose are constraints on bilateral exchanges of power between different zones. And then an alternative that you might wish to consider when you acknowledge the fact that actually the true physics of the power network are not that simple, that there are interdependencies between net injections in different areas. An alternative which you might want to consider is to impose linear inequalities on the net injections in different zones, and this is the so-called flow-based market coupling model, which is going to be which is basically what's new about the Central Western European market and the reason we're investigating this topic in this work. Whatever approach you want to take, and as Patrick mentioned earlier, you've got to be diligent about N-1 security, and this is emphasized also in system operator guidelines. The interesting evolution that occurred in May 2015 was the launch of the flow-based market coupling model, so the transition from an ATC model to a flow-based model in Central Western Europe. The motivation here is that you can do things with inequalities on net injections that you cannot do with limits on bilateral exchanges, and therefore you increase the flexibility of the market clearing model, enable more trading to take place, and hopefully increase welfare. And it's interesting to note that CWE is seen as a front runner in this evolution, and there are other entities, for example, Nord Pool, that are waiting to see how this unfolds and considering also jumping to flow-based market coupling. So as the European Commission put it in words, the motivation for flow-based market coupling is to acknowledge the fact that there are interdependencies in net injections. We can't control individually the flow of power on separate paths, and therefore we want to create a scope for optimizing the allocation of capacity, of transmission capacity in highly interdependent grids. As I mentioned earlier, the argument here is that with a flow-based model you can do more than you can do with imposing limits on bilateral exchanges, and this was quantified by parallel simulations conducted by TSOs to amount to up to 95 million euros per year for the CWE region. So this increase in the feasible space that allows you in the day ahead to generate an additional welfare of 95 million euro. What is missing from this analysis, however, is the fact that then you move into real time, and then you actually have to solve the congestion that the zonal model is causing, and on top of that you need to deal with the failure of elements, the realization of forecast errors, and this implies additional costs. These costs can actually be very significant and to some extent overshadow the benefits that are reported in the day ahead. So the real time has a great significance, that's the message here, and they were quantified to close to 1 billion euros for 2015 for the CWE region, according to ENSOE. So our interest in this work is to understand the extent to which flow-based market coupling does a better job than ATC-based models in accounting for physical flows, and understand a bit the qualitative reasons behind that, and to make a statement about what's the implication in terms of welfare. There has been work on the topic. The work is gaining increasing attention because it's being implemented as we speak. So regarding ATC models, the literature goes quite back, and Jensen in 2017 provides a nice overview of work that shows that ATC zonal models are outperformed by nodal models. And then there is the question, I guess Lang's talk kind of touched on this, of to what extent do simplifications of the zonal network actually, which is a model, actually represent accurately the physical flows resulting on lines, and that work was addressed by 2 papers by Vaniek. Then there's 2 pieces of work that I can refer to that bring up a very practically relevant issue, which is when you're aggregating a network, in this super network, you need to decide on certain parameters like the capacity of an aggregate line. That line doesn't actually physically exist. So what is the capacity of the aggregate? That can affect the model a lot, and that's something that to a large extent TSOs decide on in a discretionary fashion, and it can strongly influence the outcome of the market clearing. There's another issue that we don't touch on here, but I think people are actively looking into that as well, which is the definition of bidding zones. That's another thing that you have the flexibility to decide on. And then there's 2 papers that address that, and Kenneth has published a paper in 2015 that describes how flow-based is implemented in the CWE region. So what we bring into the picture compared to this past work is a novel proposition of how to think about these zonal models that doesn't depend on these discretionary parameters, because depending on how, as a modeler, you pick these parameters, you have a very different storyline. So we want to create a best case storyline for flow-based market coupling so that we can meaningfully compare it to LMP. And that's the first contribution. Then one thing that has not been addressed in previous work is the question of N-1 security, which is, as Patrick again mentioned, very important in European operations, and is to some extent only approximately, so there's a bit of a difference in the philosophy of how US and European markets deal with this. And then the third contribution that we bring to the table is a detailed numerical case study, which also necessitates the development of algorithms for conducting it. And I think the policy messages are interesting. So the first one is that flow-based and ATC don't necessarily seem to be all that different. And the second is that they're both significantly outperformed by Nodal, which as a bottom line conclusion questions, should Nord Pool be considering this transition to zonal, or is it worth it, or should, there has been a discussion initiated in Europe about Nodal, is it worth considering that discussion more seriously? So I will now proceed to present our framework for thinking about zonal markets. So I'm going to quickly list the assumptions that we're using in this work. So we are assuming that all the action is going on in terms of trading in the day ahead. We're not accounting for earlier bilateral trading that takes place. And we have a bid format where entities submit price quantity pairs to the day ahead market. We assume that the demand is inelastic, although that doesn't create any complications in terms of the methodology that we present. And we assume that the system operator knows all about the physics of the network. In what sense? What's the topology? What are the susceptances of the lines? And what is the installed production capacity at every location? The nodal model is doing the following. Since we assume an inelastic demand, we're minimizing production cost. So we accept bids up to a certain fraction of their total quantity, and we have linearized representation of the power flow constraints using bus angles. So concretely, this is the model that we're looking at. We decide on the V variable, which is the fraction of a bid that is accepted. The flow on individual lines, that's the F. The theta is the bus angles. So we, V again represents a fraction of a bid that's accepted. The net injection equals the outgoing flow. We need to respect the thermal limits of lines, and we linearize flows using a B theta formulation. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about this 4-node example. So we already put it up here in a picture. When you consider a zonal model, what you want to do is aggregate different nodes into zones. So in this specific example, what we're doing is aggregating nodes 1 and 2 into zone A, aggregating node 3 into zone B, and aggregating node 4 into zone C. And now what the challenge over here now is that we have a new network with 3 nodes and only 3 edges, and we need to basically define certain parameters for this new network. So the idea of how things are done currently is that we consider for actually solving this model in a market clearing formulation. So our control variables now in the zonal models are not the nodal injections, they are the zonal injections. So we dilute our control space. And the question becomes, how do you account for the physics of the power flow and how they interact with the limitations of lines? So the current approach that's employed considers a base case, says suppose that the system on a base case is dispatched at this level, and let's do a first order Taylor approximation around the current operating point. So we assume a base case of zonal injections, we assume reference flows, and then we basically have this flow-based domain over here, which is a first order Taylor approximation of the actual flows. Now, there's 2 things that are tricky about this. First of all, we need to define these power transfer distribution factors, which are indexed by aggregate line and zone. And what do they mean? There's the usual notion of PTDFs in a nodal model. If I increment my injection in zone Z marginally, what will be the incremental flow in zonal line L? And this is how now I create this flow-based domain where you see we have linear inequalities of net injections that are trying to capture the physics of the network and the limits of the thermal limits of the lines. So this is what the model looks like, and what you want to be focusing on here is not that the resolution of our control is now zonal, it's not nodal. We have these p variables which are defined per zone. So again, we're accepting individual bids. Now the zonal injections are into the network are equal to the net power injections of all the generators located in that zone, and we have these this PTDF polytope which respects power balance, and we have this approximation of the thermal limits and the physics. Now, the practical problems here are two. The first is that we would like ideally the point around which we're linearizing in order to improve accuracy to be close to the market clearing solution of this model. But the market clearing solution of this model affects the base point. So we have a circular definition. At the same time, there is significant discretionary freedom by the TSOs in terms of selecting this parameter here, because this parameter is not something that's physically measurable. To a large extent, it's something that's so it's not physically measurable. But it affects the performance significantly. So if I, as a modeler, want to say something about this model and I assume a certain PTDF of zone to zonal line, the answer of my model can depend a lot on what I choose in terms of this parameter value. So we take a step back and we say, okay, but let's make a meaningful analysis by asking ourselves, what is the legal requirements imposed by the law of the land regarding zonal pricing? So we go back to the European Commission regulations. So there are two things that a zonal model should respect. It should allow all area trades that cannot be shown to cause a problem and harm the network, and it should ban all trades that can be proven to cause security problems or overloading. So what that means mathematically is basically a projection that I'm going to talk about momentarily, but I'm going to already illustrate this concept in this simple 3-node example over here. So in this simple 3-node example, we have 100 megawatts of demand at every node. We have generators located at all 3 locations, and we have a congested line, which is line 1, 2, with a capacity of 25 megawatts. And we have this linear transformation basically that says that we have one zone which is node A, and one zone which is one zone, zone A, which is node 1, and one zone, zone B, which is node 2 and 3, and we have this linear transformation relating nodal injections to zonal injections. So if I ask you which configurations of zonal injections satisfy the laws of the European Commission, the rationale is the following. So let's consider a couple of different examples here. So if I don't trade anything, then I can respect the regulations mentioned earlier in the sense of being able to find a nodal net injection that satisfies the zonal net injections without violating the physics of the network. Can anybody see what that nodal net injection is? I'm looking for an R that satisfies all these conditions and results in, through this linear transformation, in zeros. One option would be 0. So that one is cool. And then this one is not actually admissible because you are here trying to push, you're forced to push R1 very high because of the PA, but you can only push R2 so low, and you can't push it low enough because of these upper bounds here to avoid violating the constraint of 25. So what we're doing here basically is looking at a projected space. That's basically the nature of the exercise. So it turns out, again, falling back to the law of the land, what we're doing is we're defining a mathematical way to represent that, and the answers that you get for these different trial points is the first and fourth are admissible, the second and third are not, and in fact if you apply Fourier mode skew elimination, you can find the exact polytope in the zonal net injection space that is the projection of the R space into the zonal space. So geometrically what's going on is the following. You're looking here at a three-dimensional space because we also have the power balance, so we're just considering 3 out of the 4 variables, and we're basically projecting that through this linear transformation into this two-dimensional zonal space, and we will this mapping, you take any point here, it maps to a single point here, but if you take a single point here, it might be the result of different points from the nodal space. But this is how we propose to represent the regulation of the European Commission for zonal modeling. So this now creates an interesting mathematical challenge of working with this implicitly, with this projection, basically. So this creates some interesting modeling and computational challenges. But this is, in mathematical terms, what I've defined. And in fact, this definition of this polytope is guaranteed to respect the laws of the European Commission. And interestingly, I'll show this through a simple numerical example. The current practice, where we're defining a base point and are deciding on PTDF's zone to zonal line, can be shown to violate the laws of the Commission. So this is the simple, but before I go to the simple example, let me also talk about the ATC model. So that was the flow-based model. In the ATC model, the idea is that we're lifting from the nodal net positions into the space of bilateral exchanges, and then we're imposing these box constraints on the space of bilateral exchanges. So if I decide on R's, if I decide on zonal net positions, that implies so we get this lifting over here in this higher dimensional space. So this is the admissible flow-based polytope in the space of zonal net positions. This is the admissible polytope in the space of bilateral exchanges. But remember, the nature of the constraints that we're imposing on bilateral exchanges are box constraints. So basically, we're trying to fit as big parallelogram as possible into this irregularly shaped polytope here. So we do that by solving a nonlinear convex optimization problem, and we, by adopting this methodology, again, we propose a zonal model for ATCs that respects the laws of the Commission, and we have no guarantee that the existing methodology, in fact, respects the 2 rules that I mentioned earlier. Again, that will be demonstrated in the numerical example. So graphically, this is what's going on. We have the lifting from the zonal space into the bilateral exchange space. We're maximizing the volume, and then we're mapping that back into the zonal space, and we get our usual diamond-shaped flow-based, net injection polytope for the ATC model. So let's investigate a small-scale network and see what we can say about these different approaches. So I will be comparing the 3 following approaches: a nodal model, the current practice with that base point and the discretionary parameters, the proposal that we make for flow-based, which is the best case version of flow-based in the sense of implicitly looking for the best choice of discretionary parameters, and the ATC model. So this is the 4-node example that you saw earlier. We have generators at all locations and consumers at locations 2 and 4. And we're going to do 2 investigations. The first is on congestion between countries or between zones, kind of what, well, not necessarily, I'm not sure Lang was limited to that necessarily, but we're going to look at what happens on lines between zones and within zones. So here is the result of the exercise for between zone congestion. So I'm presenting the results of the 4 different models in terms of the total cost performance. For the nodal model, we have nodal prices. For the zonal model, we have zonal prices. And this is the one thing that Lang actually explicitly mentioned earlier. There's a model that thinks that something is going to happen with the physics, but that model produces an actual market outcome. And when the physical reality kicks in, then you have the actual flows. And the question is, are the flow-based flows close to the actual flows. So that's what's being recorded here. There's no such thing for the ATC model, so we don't report that. And in this column, we report whether we violate the finite capacity of this line and to what extent. There's a couple of interesting things going on here. All zonal models overload the line. On top of that, it's interesting to, and this comes back to our proposal being a best case version of flow-based. This extended polytope definition does better in terms of accuracy and better in terms of overloading the line. And you can also, it's worth spending a bit of time comparing the cost differences here, but it's actually more useful to do that graphically. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you in the space of net positions, what are the feasible regions defined by the different models. I'm going to start with just showing you the market clearing outcome of the LMP model, which is up here. And then the flow-based with approximation is the blue polyhedron. So that's worth comparing to the flow-based model with the extended polytope. That is the green over here. So here, if we compare these two shapes, we notice that current practice is violating European Commission law in two directions. First of all, it's cutting off some space that you can't prove would harm the network. Secondly, it's allowing trades to take place that you can prove would harm the network. So this definition of arbitrarily chosen flow-based parameters is tricky, even for a 4-node problem. And then you have, it's also worth seeing how the optimal solutions are moving around and generating these cost differences for the different models. So that's the message for the inter-zonal congestion. We do a similar exercise for intra-zonal congestion. So we have a line with a finite capacity within a zone. The question is, can flow-based cope well with lines within a zone? And we kind of use the same numbers, but it's just we impose a different, the finite capacity in a different place. But qualitatively, the results are quite similar. Again, the flow-based with approximation does a worse job than our proposal for approximating the flows on the congested line. All zonal models violate the line capacity. And in this case, the only difference is that the blue set is a superset of the green set. So it's a relaxation, as opposed to also, so it's violating European laws only in one direction. That's the difference. But the takeaways are the following. So all zonal models cause flows, physical flows that violate the, that overload the transmission system. And you can be violating the European Commission law in both directions. And ultimately, the problem is that with that price signal that you're sending over that entire zone, you're losing track of nodal resolution. You're basically dispatching in merit order within the zone, and that's causing trouble. You can't fine-tune the price that you send to every different location to control the output. Because we find consistently that the flow-based model with the extended polytope is outperforming the flow-based model with approximation, we're only gonna I'm only going to show results for this one and drop this one for the numerical case study. Okay, now if we move to a detailed simulation of the Central Western European market, it's here important to introduce the concept of N-1 security. And what we mean by N-1 security is the ability to withstand the failure of any single transmission element in the network. So what that creates now is a new polytope. Let's think about it for what it looks like for the nodal model. It creates a new polytope for the a new N-1 polytope for the nodal model, which is basically the intersection of all polytopes that you would get by considering at most one line failure, where we're failing lines by switching the flow of that line to 0 through the B theta model. So because each of these is a polytope, the intersection here, which is the n-1 polytope, is a polytope, and we can describe it with a set of linear inequalities. You could try doing that in closed form for the 4-node example that I showed you, but it becomes hopeless for the 631 bus network that we're actually working with. So instead, what we're doing is we're proposing an algorithm that's creating outer approximations of that n-1 polytope. The concept is actually not too complex. So what we're doing is we work with our outer approximation. We plug it into our market clearing. Market clearing produces a market outcome. We check, are we within the polytope or not? The checking is a bit interesting. I'm going to talk about that more momentarily. If we're not, we project onto the n-1 polytope, generate a cut, and work with the refined polytope. Now, the checking part you want to be careful about, because there are efficient and inefficient ways to do it. So the way we're approaching this is by looking for the worst possible failure that maximizes the distance of our current market clearing point from any one of the contingency dependent polytopes. And if this quantity is positive, then we're out of the polytope, but if it's 0, then we're sitting in. So this is a continuous optimization problem. We work with the dual of that, and because the outer maximization is just binary variables, we use McCormick relaxations, which are exact in our case, and we can show finite convergence of this procedure. Ultimately, Alex was the one who first proposed this idea, and we're applying it in our context. So the concept is similar for the zonal models. It's kind of the same idea. We're creating polytopes now in the zonal net injection space that are intersections of the contingency specific polytopes, and it's more or less the same procedure but applied on a different space. For the ATC model, it's a bit different because you basically need to be working with the corners of that parallelogram that I talked about earlier in order to define the maximum volume box, but the concept is similar. Now, I should note the following. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but there are unit commitment decisions involved here, as well as reserve decisions, which we are accounting for. The nice thing about our procedure is the fact that we can have a complex model of the zonal injections while having a linear pricing of non-convexities as applied in European markets. So the two don't preclude each other. We can combine both in a single model, and we're assuming we're enhancing the euphemia model with a reserve product. That's all. The gory details of that are in the draft, which I can share with you, but there's not enough space to talk about that here. But the assumption is we're basically doing a day-ahead clearing of reserve and energy. So we're accounting for that in the real network. So this is what the CWE model looks like. We have a day-ahead forward market followed by a real-time market. In the day-ahead, we have two types of generators. Slow-moving units need to be decided in the day-ahead. They can only be turned off in real time. And also, the zone commits to a trading position. And then we move to real time. There's elements failing. There's forecast errors being realized. We're doing congestion management and balancing, and we're recording the relevant quantities here. As I mentioned, we're accounting for euphemia style pricing using strict linear pricing model of Mehdi and Mathieu. This is the actual model that we're working with. So it's 630 buses, 945 branches. Again, I mentioned we split the generators into slow and fast, and we have a significant amount of renewables in the network. And we are running a simulation that for every time step of the market draws 1150 samples of uncertainty that could occur at that time step. So we're basically simulating 100 years of operation. So the zonal representation of this 632 bus model is this 4-zone model. So we have France, Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and poor little Belgium between the the big players. And now to conduct the simulation, we use JUMP, Gurobi, IPOpt, and Express. We deploy, this is something I would strongly recommend if you're interested in using high-performance computing. Julia has made this very easy, so I strongly recommend it. And the overall simulation required about 7,600 CPU hours. We ran the simulation on 2 high-performance computing clusters. One is at the CAB cluster at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and the other is the CESI cluster at the Walloon region of Belgium. And these are the results that we get. So the first model that you see here is a perfect foresight model where first stage decisions are contingent on the uncertainty that would materialize. We want to basically understand to what extent congestion is systematic versus erratic due to the realization of forecast errors or element failures. So there's a reasonable deviation between nodal pricing and the being able to perfectly anticipate uncertainty. Nodal pricing is actually using n-1 security and setting up the model in a way that's maybe more expensive, but trying to protect against n-1 security. Now the interesting takeaway is the almost identical performance of flow-based and ATC model. So we have metrics to demonstrate why that's happening, but the ultimate takeaway is that the inefficiencies are in the order of 600 million euro per year, and the 2 approaches are performing in a starkly similar way, which questions the initiative of going through flow-based in order to do better than ATC. This is what's actually going on in terms of cost breakdown. So in the day-ahead market, things look very similar. Actually, LMP is actually even doing a bit worse than the zonal model. So we're splitting here fuel costs of slow, fast units and CO2 emissions. You see that the LMP model is actually a bit more expensive. And then enters real time. This is the part of the work that was omitted by all the parallel runs that have been conducted in past research. So this is where there's a lot of the action going on. So here is where LMP delivers on the more expensive day-ahead schedule by better controlling for congestion and basically avoiding dispatching up fast units and pushing slow-moving units that look like a good idea in the day ahead to their minimum load level and incurring fixed costs for having these units, having started these units in the first place. So that's typical of what's going on in northern Germany today. You get a zonal signal in the whole country. You start up coal units in the north where you have tons of wind supply. You're over-congesting the Polish network, and then come real time, surprise, surprise, you're congesting the network and pushing those coal units in technical min. That's not the most efficient way to do things. So this is another figure corroborating the fact that basically comparing the 2 zonal approaches with each other and against the nodal one. What we have here is the difference in the nodal injection. So if I were comparing the nodal model with the flow-based model, they appear to be quite different. The nodal model with the ATC model appear to be quite different, and the flow-based model with the ATC model are very close to each other in terms of nodal net injections. The same is the case for the patterns of overloading, and you observe significant overloading in the German network, but also a notable overloading of cross-border lines for both the flow-based model as well as the ATC model. And this is further analytics that support the fact that we're committing in non-optimal locations in the zonal approach. So if you ask yourself, for locations where nodal and committed in the day ahead but zonal didn't, what happened when you moved from day ahead to real time? You started up a bunch of units in those locations. For locations where zonal committed but nodal didn't, what happened in real time? You pushed units off or to their technical minimum in real time. So this is another piece of analytics to support our argument. So to conclude, and I'm left with 2 minutes more or less, We propose a new way of modeling zonal markets. We feel that it's meaningful because it doesn't depend on discretionary parameters. Actually, Ignacio evolved through a lot of years of work trying to come up with this idea where we were trying to develop ATC models, but the question was what should be the ATC capacity. Same idea for flow-based. You kind of write down the flow-based model, but then depending on the flow-based parameter, you get very different answers. So, but you know, there was a bit of thinking involved into proposing this specific way of mathematically describing European Commission regulations, and the advantage of it is it doesn't depend on discretionary parameters. We have a problematic performance of both zonal approaches in terms of dealing both with congestion between zones but also within zones, and the two are very close to each other in terms of real-time performance, and both of them are significantly outperformed by nodal pricing. So with that, I will thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions.
Any comments, questions? Many? Jalal?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. So, okay, it's clear that nodal mechanism works better, and it's 600 million euros per year. But can we easily say that this is the cost we pay to have the same prices within each zone? I mean, yeah, we pay a lot of cost, but at the other hand, we earn a lot of other things which we have the same price within the zone. So, yeah, in terms of the cost, it's higher, but we gain in other things. I mean,
I can only talk to you about things we can model. So,
but maybe you could clarify, what do we get? What is the benefit? That's what I had the same question. So could you clarify what is the benefit of not using?
I mean, Patrick can say better, but the main thing is that we have the same prices within each zone. So, well, then it's more fair for the customers.
No. There's a part.
No.
Patrick, go for it.
fire away, Patrick.
So yes, interesting, but okay. The real process is more complex than that. So the fact that we compute PTDF is a kind of proxies. So the process to compute the PTDF are quite clear, and include all n-1 all the possible corrective actions.
Sorry to interrupt you already, but if you can send me a reference to the clarity of that process, that would be excellent.
I'm not sure that is fully transparent. I'm not sure that there is but between us in ENSOE,
with it
we have a
between
document,
TSOs.
and we have specification for that, and we have an industrial process that to industrialize this process. So we have the full specification of this process that has been done by GE or anyway. So there is a full specification of this process, and yes. So there is n-1 all the corrective actions. So the phase shifter perhaps could be embedded in that, but the switching, I'm sure that is very difficult, and we are doing that. It's about not splitting. It's not about opening lines. So we are splitting nodes because at the boundary we don't have only one line for sure. We have many of them, and we have some configuration of substation that we can play with. And we are doing that routinely, and the phase shifter transformer also.
For planning or for security?
So we try to compute the PTDF using that. And we give all this possible, it's a kind of proxy. And we compute all the PTDF for all these cases, and then we compute by kind of pre-solving the binding, the feasible domain. And we send to the market this feasible domain. And something more than that, even that is too complex for the market participant in Europe. They put, for example, some.
Let's stop on that one to discuss it a bit because I'm really interested also in the next one. But for that one, I don't understand how that one rationalizes zonal.
Because it's just because the people don't want to see all the complexity. So they want to have a proxy just to we don't want to be exposed to the full complexity.
Okay.
So they don't want to be exposed to the full complexity, and the full complexity is large, and is. So we send some kind of convex approximation and to the market participant, and some of them are
But we have US markets that deal with the complexity.
Even that is too complex for them.
For example, what do you think about the fact that US markets deal with the complexity?
deal with some kind of complexity, but I'm not sure. I don't understand. I don't know exactly what's going on the switching and on the dynamic rating.
Let's stay on the switching for a moment.
Yes,
Let's stay on the switching for a
dynamic
moment.
rating, for example. How do you incorporate dynamic rating and switching?
Yeah. Let's stay on the switching for a moment. When you refer, I'm really curious to understand this one. When you talk about switching, are you talking about security responses to N-1 contingencies, or are you talking about actually planning?
Both preventive or corrective, both.
So how long does a switching action stick around? Because my understanding of corrective switching is something trips, we reconfigure, we fix the thing that tripped, we return to a base case. Or you kind of stick around with the corrective action for an indefinite amount of time.
We can.
I think in the UK they had this idea they could do it for full day.
They can, but
We have some automatic devices that are installed locally, as they can switch automatically in case of congestion. For example, we have, can have this one-to-one.
So maybe Hank, let me throw, because I think this one is really interesting. What is the practice in the US? You do possibly switching in response to an N-1 contingency. Does that undermine the argument of having a nodal resolution in your control?
Sorry, I didn't get the context here.
The context is that because we have switching, we have a lot of non-convexity in the problem, and therefore nodal prices make little sense. I'm not sure I understand that argument, and that's my question to you. You have, I think, corrective switching actions also in the US. Why not apply a more granular control when you have the computational machinery and the control infrastructure to do it, just because you're doing corrective switching in real time? Maybe I'm not seeing something here, and maybe you can offer an insight from US market operations.
Okay, I'm not sure. No, there are quite several aspects that I'm trying to guess that the issue here. You know, in real time, I may not really hit on exactly what you're talking about. You know, in real time, that when you get down to let's start with the 15 minutes ahead here. You know, in the last sort of 15 minutes, you know, basically all this N-1 contingency is presumed to be sort of in place. I think, again, here, two different ISOs have two different ways of dealing with it in case that the reserve is falling below the N-1 contingency requirements. What do you do? And some ISOs will say, now we want to preserve that requirement or we'll shed load. So there's nothing that we'll do on the supply side. And then at the PJM, that basically is different. Then we will actually let these minimum requirements be violated, and we will just run and then begin actually for the next 15 minutes we will actually catch up. So
that's load shedding, but for topology switching, do you actually switch lines to deal with contingencies?
You mean the turn off and off lines? No, we don't do that.
Okay. So here's a thought I have, and call me crazy. We've become accustomed to very active topology control because our transmission allocation methods are inadequate, to put it in my point of view. And switching helps a lot with congestion management that might not have existed in the first place if we were better at. So we're definitely accustomed to it operationally. It seems like in the US, but regardless of, so there's this circularity argument there, but regardless of that, I don't understand the argument that just because we do switching to deal with contingencies in Europe, we shouldn't control things nodally. I don't understand that argument.
No, it's not. I'm not against any kind of very detailed optimization. I'm against the fact that you are using the dual variable non-convex problem to send signal to the people. So I'm not against the temporal variability of the price. I am against the spatial variability of the price that are very dependent on the topology. So I'm not against optimization. I love optimization. I love very detailed simulation.
The topology, again, I repeat, the topology.
And once again, we need
temporary
optimization much more before the market appears.
Sure.
So there is no problem.
We know that, and we respect EDF and RTE deeply.
But there's no problem about that.
The topology correction is
but I love control
it's a correction.
and feedback. I love control and feedback. I think it's a good idea to do that and to put this in a framework. Because if we put very advanced control and we are not putting value on that, then what happens? So the smart grid is a kind of virtual stuff. If we want to be smart, you want to put some value on the fact to be smart.
Close on that one, then we move to the next question. Otherwise,
So here's to close that up in a constructive way. I think that a very interesting research question here is to what extent can switching salvage poor congestion management decisions, which creates a really interesting extension of this model where you add switching on top, and that one is tough. We're actually starting to look into that. But the argument that we're doing corrective switching for a few minutes to deal with something temporary doesn't mean that the base case should be operated as if we cannot control nodally. That's my opinion. Okay, but I'll stop there. I'm taking advantage of the fact that I'm up here.
Yeah, if I may.
After.
Okay, so.
Sorry. Do you mind if I think now I understand, just add one quick comment here?
Very quick.
There was a study on this switching theoretically. This has nothing to do with the practice. If you have perfect switching capability, this non-convexity disappears and zonal nodal the difference disappears and everything actually works just fine, and then switching actually has benefit of flexibility. That's
on these good words.
Yeah, actually it's very good because I wanted to ask more or less the same. That okay, so we have the switching, which is let's say an extra control that we have on the network, but we don't have that in the, let's say, day ahead, let's say US style nodal scheduling, right? So what feels to me is happening is that we have one topology. We pretend that we know what is the value, locational value of, let's say, energy in the day ahead, but then that's computed on a network that is not the real network. So why not having the switching in the market clearing, let's say?
I think indirectly we have it in Europe through the flow-based matrix actually has contingency actions in it in Euphemia. Sure. But we have that.
Yeah, but I'm not asking that. I know that we have it in Zonal. I'm wondering why not having it in the nodal.
Oh, I think people are moving towards. You mean with switching accounted for? Yep. I think that's so. My understanding of what's going on in the U.S. People in the audience know that better than me, and they can correct me. So there's a proxy of this through N-1 contingency constraints in LMP-based models, and I think one of the whole ideas of the ARPA competition is to explicitly represent N-1 contingencies in the OPF. So that's my understanding. I might be wrong about that one, so maybe someone can correct me. But I think there's a move in that direction more explicitly in US markets.
All right.
Now, but regarding Hung Po's really quickly, the Dutch TSO does 2 switches per day. So it's not, I don't think that reality is TSOs actually thinking of completely optimizing overall possible. There is a base topology that the network is working around. So I hear what you bring, and I think it's very interesting what you bring up as a theoretical statement, but there's also the practical reality that you're starting up coal units in northern Germany.
We had a question.
Yeah.
I have questions related to the numbers. I didn't really get how you compute these 600 million euro per year from your simulations.
Yeah. So this one is the sum of the day-ahead fixed costs of starting up slow units plus real-time operating costs of moving things around.
It's an average over your...
Over 100 years of operation, yeah.
Which you have simulated.
Which we have simulated, yes.
And the other thing, my question was that can you compare your numbers with what is observed in reality?
Yeah, sure. We did that exercise. So we have calibrated parts of the model to come close to the observed, the reported congestion management that took place in 2015 in the CW area, which is one of the reasons I mentioned it. So.
I have a question myself, actually. So we're talking about what it means and the European regulation and so on. We had the paper of Jensen. Some of the proposal is to say, let's just wipe it out. We want to have virtual bidders. We want to have a lot of virtual stuff. Yeah. Why don't we say these parameters are levies that we can optimize so as to put the system in a state where we know we can optimally redispatch, right? So have you considered it also? Or?
So I think implicitly that's what.
Optimize the ATCs?
Yeah. Implicitly, that's what we're doing with this Polytope. So we're trying to not
Sticking to a feasibility.
sticking to the commission law. So the only thing we're requiring is the legal statements, and then we're trying to find a projection in the zonal injections. You could argue that you can't do better than that, because if you step out of that Polytope, you're illegal in one way or another. So I want to say implicitly that's how we're. That's why you also saw that we're more accurately capturing the flows on the congested lines and overloading lines less.
Okay. Jean, if you had a point.
A small technical question, perhaps a stupid one, but why, when you showed a case with congestion, that in a 4-node example where the interzone line was the congested line,
Yeah.
why do you have the flow-based market coupling with exact projection? Why does it congest this line? Because there is a single line between two zones.
Because that's a good question. So the net. That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah. So the net injection, the zonal net injection, may respect. So that's here. They're both doing the same in terms of nodal net injection, but then the zonal model is sending a clearing price for the whole zone. So within the zone, it's doing merit order, and it's burning the line.
Any other points? Yeah, I do.
So, given how hard it might be to actually move to LMP in a European situation, how much of the difference, like that 5% difference, could be achieved by splitting one or two critical zones?
Yeah, that's actually, I think people are, Eddie, the tricky thing about that one is that committing to that independent of network conditions is tough. So zone splitting really depends on the configuration of net demand, which changes a lot, especially now due to renewables. So the question, I think, is investigated with a lot of interest by NSOE. But in my opinion, the best zone splitting is the splitting of the highest resolution zone splitting.
We worked that out, I think, actually.
And so he said 2 years ago they were open to the idea of dynamic zoning.
Yeah.
So,
But I don't know how do we find zone, because in a flow base, the critical branches could change over the time. So the hub are defined. So you have to select a hub to put the bits, but then you use all the model of the full network. So then depending on the hours, depending on wind or no wind, the critical branches are changing.
If you use PTDFs, you're stuck. Yeah.
So the flow base is not exactly a zonal stuff. There is a kind of fuzzy. Of course, we have some hubs, but the critical line are changing over time. So it's something a bit more. Yeah, but
I think we're gonna need to close if we want to go for lunch. So for those who still have questions, I invite you to bother Anthony over lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.